The first presidential debate, voters hearing from the candidates.
I don't know if the debates are really changing any minds. They're just trying to convince people that it's worth taking a couple hours off work and showing up at the polls.
An analysis of issues, including the economy and what that means for you in the state of Arizona.
They're both bad. I mean, it's a train wreck or a dumpster fire, in my opinion.
Plus, engaging the younger voter. This is Arizona Week. Hello, and thanks for joining us. In 6 weeks, voters will cast their ballots. The first debate on the record and 2 more to go. The polls showing Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in a close race. On Monday night, the 2 candidates debated some of the issues. Jim Rounds is an economist and has this analysis.
The entire federal budget is about $4 trillion. Now, if you talk about what Clinton wanted to do in terms of the additional taxes and spending, it's about $1 trillion over many years. I think it's over 10 years, and that's a pretty decent % increase. What Trump wanted to do, and there's 2 estimates on his costs for the tax cuts, is he wants either a $5 trillion cut, and one organization said it was going to cost about $10 trillion. So even if it's 5 over 10 years, that's a big percentage of the budget. And the budget is about $4 trillion, but we spend about $500 billion more than we bring in each year, and that contributes to this overall deficit, the overall debt. So I think even if you break it down into an annual amount, I think people have some perspective on the scale that they're talking about, and that's what disappoints me, because it's not a matter of the idea being bad. In either case, both of them have some good ideas. There are some bad ideas too. It's the scale. So it's not this policy is right or wrong in a lot of cases. That's great to maybe reduce the corporate income tax, but can you afford to go from point A to point B? Probably not. Can we afford to spend this extra money on some of the education programs? I'm all for workforce programs and trying to help people go from one level to another up that income ladder, but can we afford it? And their main job is to balance the budget, and I don't think either is going to be able to implement their plan.
For years, I think since 2009, the federal minimum wage has been $7.25 an hour. Will this candidate, either one, propose a decent plan that could raise it, or is it left to Congress? Should it be left to the states?
I think it's okay to leave it to the states. In some cases, like with Arizona, discussing raising it to 10 and then 12, there are going to be some economic repercussions. Whenever you raise the minimum wage to something that's a little bit closer to the prevailing wage, you're not going to have as many negative consequences like people getting laid off. When you start getting to, say, 12 to 15, that's when you can have some problems. So some of the states that are considering maybe moving the minimum wage up to 15, the economic consequences could be actually quite severe. If it's 10 to 12, it kind of depends on what the wages are in the area, but I have a different perspective on it. I like the idea of if there's an identified failure in the system, okay, then government can intervene and they can get involved in these programs. But I know for a fact that workforce programs across the country and even in Arizona haven't been that effective. I would much rather have that person have an opportunity to go from that lower income level, get some education, go up to that next income level, go up to that next income level, and fix that. That's the underlying problem. Raising the minimum wage, if it's a little bit too high, might make it so that they're happy staying at this lower skill level job because they're making more money. There won't be as much incentive to move up, and also some people will lose their jobs if it's too high. So, and this isn't the most popular opinion. In fact, the popular opinion right now is to raise the minimum wage, and 12 seems to be the amount that a lot of different communities and states are settling on, except for that broader push for the $15 an hour that we've all seen in the protests and things like that. But it seems like the more systemic problem is how do you get that person to find time to get that education to go up to the higher level? And I feel like we can still do that. I think we can have some reforms in Arizona on workforce, and I wish the minimum wage proposal here was maybe 2 years from now rather than now. I wish we could have had a chance to try to address this workforce issue.
Entitlements like Social Security, Medicare, 2020 comes around and we could be taking more out of the system than we're putting into the system. What happens then?
Well, we have short-term issues. We're in an expansion that's getting long in the tooth. This is actually one of the longer economic expansions that we've ever had, but it really hasn't felt like it because it's been weak. So history books are going to show when they just show dates, this is one of the longest expansions, and students 20 years from now are going to be thinking back to, oh, they all must have been driving Porsches during that time. It was just fantastic economic prosperity. The date doesn't match the quality, so it's been a weak expansion. So there could be some pressure just on balancing the budget, not at a state level and at the federal level, just with the normal business cycle issues. But these are much bigger, longer term problematic issues as we go down the road. And I'm already saying thank you to my 12-year-old son for bearing some of this cost, because he's going to have to pay for a lot of what we're building up in terms of debt. And that's why I get back to, I'm concerned about the extent that Trump is wanting to cut taxes because of the scale. He has some good ideas, but it's a scale. But I also am a little bit concerned about Clinton's proposal for the additional spending, because it's not coming at the right time in the business cycle. And I think that we need a little bit more reform in the federal government budget on what should we be spending money on, and maybe where did we have a little bit of mission creep over the last couple of decades.
Which candidate proposed an economic plan that you think would benefit Arizona?
They're both bad. I mean, it's a train wreck or a dumpster fire, in my opinion. There's got to be some middle ground, but what they're going to find out is the way the politics is going to work is they're going to each have to be firm with what they want to do, because getting elected is more about marketing who you are. It's selling a product. It's less about getting into the details. And you even saw that in the debate. Each of them were saying, I never said that. And then an hour later, they were showing the text messages and the little clips, the video clips of exactly what they said. But a lot of people don't watch that. They're selling a product. What's going to happen, though, is at some point, they're going to realize, oh, we can't do this. We can't afford this extra spending. We can't afford this cut. Business cycles are going to exist despite how wonderful they are, because they're going to solve all the world's problems based on how they used a lot of the word I and me in the debate. A lot of egos involved, but that's just not how it works. I think the business cycle and the normal business constraints are going to pull both of them back. I think it's going to pull Trump back a little more, because he has a much more extreme proposal in terms of the cuts and the percent of the overall economy that represents. So maybe it's not a train wreck and a dumpster fire. Maybe it's just something that's not quite as extreme.
Arizona's economy continues to rebound after the Great Recession. Another analysis of the debate now, and a look at the influence of government on the economy, education, and border infrastructure. Here's George Hammond, an economist at the University of Arizona Eler College of Management.
Sure, the government influences the economy in a large number of different ways. Part of it through trade policy, making trade agreements with other countries. But more fundamentally, and also with equal impact on long-run growth, is the government's influence on education and infrastructure. So government does have a big impact.
When we think about education, are you referring higher education or K through 12 as well?
Yeah, government matters across the board. When we think about government's influence and investments on education, probably one of the biggest and most impactful avenues for overall government activity is early childhood education. Particularly high quality early childhood education is well known to have probably the biggest returns on investment, and those are long-term returns on investment. If you invest in particularly young kids in the most struggling neighborhoods and schools, those investments really do last through the kid's school life and into the workforce.
In this week's debate, we actually heard about childcare. That's pretty unusual. Would you say that is something that is going to be part of this discussion?
Sure, childcare matters as well. And this is all part of a debate on investments in human capital. And when economists think about human capital, we're often thinking directly about what's going on with education. But human capital includes health, behavioral health, your physical health. It's really a kind of a broad base. There's a broad spectrum that we need to think about because human capital is such a key driver of the overall competitiveness and the long-run growth in our economy and our standard of living.
Anything that came of this debate that talked about the border and NAFTA with respect to Arizona's economy?
Sure, there was a lot of talk about that, and I think that the international trade and the international trade agreements are getting a bit more blame than they deserve for the current state of the labor market and our overall income growth. There are a large number of factors that affect our job growth and our income growth, and the impact of the trade agreements has certainly been there, but I think the bigger impacts have really come through the impacts of automation and other factors that are actually going on. You know, one thing to keep in mind about our trade with Mexico is it's risen significantly, over the last decade. Our exports to Mexico have almost doubled during the past decade. The flow of U.S. produced goods through Arizona's border ports of entry has more than doubled over the past decade. So at least in terms of the trade performance, NAFTA has had a significant impact on U.S. and Arizona exports to Mexico. So you want to keep that in mind. I think one thing to also keep in mind is that we knew, and economists and policymakers have known for decades, that these trade agreements that ease trade barriers and make it easier for countries to trade with one another would increase our overall standard of living, but there were going to be some negative impacts on particular individuals and particular sectors. And as part of that, there were certainly recommendations, and there are programs that are designed to ease those impacts on individual sectors and workers to help them transition to sectors that are growing faster. It turns out those efforts may not have been vigorous enough or large enough.
Will we see NAFTA undergo some type of reform?
Based on what we're hearing the candidates say, it looks like there will be some additional scrutiny there. I don't know if things will change, but the one thing that we do need to keep in mind is that those trade relationships and international trade in general contributes to a higher standard of living on average across all U.S. citizens. So that freer trade is a very good thing, but we want to keep in mind that there are some negative impacts across individuals and industries, and we want to have programs in place that can really help those people find jobs and careers in other sectors that are growing.
If you're at home in Arizona and you're watching this debate unfold, what are the sorts of things you should be looking for with regard to the economy and our infrastructure in this state?
Well, I think you want to look for what the candidates are saying about adding to the infrastructure. What sorts of infrastructure are they talking about adding? What are their views on tax policy? How will they pay for that increased infrastructure, which will matter? And also for overall views on trade and education. One of the things that we know is that education over the past 30 years has really been a key driver of state and local economic growth. And the states and the local areas that did better were those that had higher levels of college attainment. And that's not likely to be less important over the next 30 years. In fact, it's likely to be a lot more important over the next 30 years. So focusing really on education and infrastructure will be key as we go forward. So that's what I look for when I listen to the candidates talk.
And for a deeper analysis of Monday night's debate, I'm joined by U of A School of Government and Public Policy professors Samara Klar and Chris Weber. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Samara, let's start with you.
Sure.
Monday night's debate, no real surprises.
I think potentially one of the only surprises I found was that there weren't more attacks. I think we might see more heated attacks in the upcoming debates. I think both candidates were fairly restrained in not calling each other out for personal attacks or personal scandals. I think both tried to stick to the issues more or less.
And Chris, you're teaching right now, so I imagine your students are watching and they want to talk about this week. What are you hearing?
Well, with respect to the debate, I would say that the first 30 minutes were somewhat calm and certainly more civil than the remaining time. The frequency of Trump interrupting Clinton, students found disconcerting, which I think sort of maps on or tracks with what many of the pundits have said about the debate.
With regard to your research that you do here, do you tend to find that debates really do matter as the voters trying to figure out who they want to pick come November? Or are people's minds already made up? Or maybe in this one, Samara, it's too early to tell even at this point.
Well, generally in presidential debates, Americans who identify as Republicans are going to vote for the Republican candidate, and Americans who identify as Democrats are going to vote for the Democratic candidate. The debates don't really serve as a point where Democrats might switch parties, or Republicans could do the same. The point of the debates is to really try to generate some enthusiasm for the candidate. At this point, so late in the election cycle, the candidates just want their supporters to come out and vote. I don't know if the debates are really changing any minds. They're just trying to convince people that it's worth taking a couple hours off work and showing up at the polls. So that's kind of the question that comes out of them.
Chris, with your students, do you hear students say, I'm going to sit this one out, or I just don't know, or maybe I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not sure this time?
Not so much. Again, I think that the debate doesn't really move people all that much historically. It only moves people, or moves the vote at most 2 to 3 percentage points. So really not all that much. There are certainly cases where kind of the trajectory or the predicted outcome has changed. So 2012 is an example of this with the first, or with the Romney-Obama debate. But historically these things it just doesn't move voters all that much. And so, in my experiences talking to students, I haven't heard of any people either switching sides or sitting it out because of this.
Right. So this time around, as it always is, we're looking for the youth vote and for the Latino vote. Is Arizona considered, as we're hearing now, a battleground state? Either one of those demographics really important in this race? Samara?
I think for sure the Latino vote is extremely important in Arizona. I don't know if the youth vote is any more important in Arizona than it would be anywhere else, although we do have 3 very large universities and other colleges as well in the state. If those students are registered in Arizona and not in their home states, then they certainly could help. And Clinton's efforts in Arizona are definitely trying to target the young people to come out and vote for her.
Chris, do you agree about the Latino population in Arizona? It's really that important for these candidates?
I think so, and I think especially in this election, that's really what has moved Arizona to the more competitive column is the salience of immigration and the Latino vote. And not only Trump's position on these issues, but McCain's position on these issues and alignment with Trump.
When we hear of the youth vote, we often hear college education being more affordable almost immediately after. Does that tend to resonate with the younger voter?
Yeah, my impression is that it does. That's an issue that's really important to the youth, and that's why Bernie Sanders, in part, was so successful in mobilizing young voters. Hillary Clinton has adopted a lot of Bernie Sanders' talking points and even policies when it comes to making college more affordable. So I think that's really helping her make inroads with younger voters.
Chris, we often hear that the youth vote, they may not show up. The candidates spend all this time, money, and energy trying to get the younger voter, but then they don't register to vote or they don't show up on Election Day. How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue with especially in this campaign, with the success of Bernie Sanders and the lacking popularity of Clinton and Trump among the youth. I think polls put it at anywhere from 10 to 11% of youth millennials won't show up to vote. Many of them will cast protest ballots for third-party candidates, which aren't likely to win. I don't know that this is more of an issue in this election than any other, but it certainly has the potential to sort of change the margin of victory for one candidate.
Samara, we have these 2 candidates who are liked and disliked, and then we have a Libertarian and we have a Green Party. We won't see that on the ballot here in Arizona, but Gary Johnson, how viable is he this time around?
I think this election provides maybe a little more opportunity for an independent candidate than what we've seen in the past, because as Chris mentioned, both candidates do have problems with enthusiasm, with favorability, trustworthy, honesty. Both of those are big issues for both Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump. However, it's really hard for independent voters to make the case that they're actually electable. As Chris was just saying, throwing away your vote is a big deterrent for candidates. Gary Johnson's recently been making the argument that voting for someone you don't like is throwing away your vote. So he's really trying to take that argument on really directly, and that's what he needs to do. It's the same obstacle Bernie Sanders faced in the primary, trying to convince people that they're actually electable. I think, Gary Johnson is doing what he can to make the case that he's electable, but it's very, very difficult.
Chris, do you think Gary Johnson will end up on one of the debate stages before November?
I don't, but returning to kind of this issue of the youth vote again, the two candidates, Stein and Johnson, are incredibly popular among, at least relative to other age groups, relatively popular with younger voters, accounting for anywhere from a quarter to a third combined of millennial vote preferences. They've gained quite a bit of ground just in the last month. Again, I don't think I don't think it's really likely to change the overall outcome of the election, but it certainly could tighten things.
Why do you suppose that is? Is it because of communication or just styles of the way they hold their rallies? What could be the reason?
There's one establishment candidate, another that says things that I think alienates many millennial voters. So it's important when we consider these voters, they're not single issue voters. It's not just making college affordable. But some of the remarks that Trump has made about women, I think, alienates a lot of millennial voters. So taken together, I think these things have led these voters to either choose to stay home and not participate, or to cast a protest vote.
So, Mayor, Donald Trump is about to make his 6th visit to Arizona, which has traditionally been a conservative state. Does this indicate that perhaps his campaign is concerned?
I think there is evidence that they should be a little concerned. Hillary Clinton's polling really well in Arizona. She no longer has a lead, but she has had the lead in Arizona at certain points. The Arizona Republic endorsed Hillary Clinton earlier this week. Is the first time they've ever endorsed a Democratic candidate. So there's a lot of signs pointing towards trouble for Trump in Arizona, and he needs every electoral vote he can get if he wants to win the presidency. So I think he's just really trying to make sure that he has the support where he thinks he can really get it.
Chris, is Arizona at play, do you think?
I think it's fairly likely to go to Trump. Kind of echoing what Samara has said, there are a lot of routes for a Clinton victory. There are fewer routes for a Trump victory, and I think Arizona, in this case, is an important state for a Trump victory. But I do think that even though we've seen kind of a tightening of things, that in terms of polling data, that it's probably pretty likely to still stay in the Republican column.
Either of you have any predictions about how the next 6 weeks really unravel as we get closer to voting day? Chris, we'll start with you.
I think we'll see a Donald Trump that's much more prepared for the debates this next time around. I think we'll see the polls kind of, again, stabilizing a bit. This tends to be the case where the data now is relatively predictive of the final outcome. So I don't think, even though we have these two relatively unpopular candidates, I think we'll see pretty stable public opinion with respect to what happens.
Okay, Samara?
Yeah, I agree with Chris. I think Trump is probably going to be much more prepared for the forthcoming debates. His campaign has undergone a shift recently. It's a little more professional. It's becoming a little more conventional. I think Hillary Clinton's probably going to rely on Barack Obama and Michelle Obama more than ever to really serve as her surrogates, especially when it comes to the millennial vote. The Obamas are very popular among the youth vote, Michelle Obama particularly. So I think we're going to see the Obamas on the campaign trail a lot. Bernie Sanders is going to be on the campaign trail, and they're just going to try to keep mobilizing. That's what they have to do at this point.
Gary Johnson is the Libertarian candidate in the presidential race. The former New Mexico governor not invited to be on the debate stage yet. I spoke with his state director earlier this week. Here's Mike Hernandez.
I think he's a fairly intelligent person that applies common sense to problems. And that's what I'm looking for in a representative, is someone that can look at a situation and look at both sides and apply common sense.
Gary Johnson was a Republican. You were a Republican. Help me understand why we're here right now talking about this candidate who doesn't represent either party.
Well, in my opinion, the Republican Party has failed to evolve. The voters have evolved, society's evolved. Not everything is black and white anymore. There's a lot of shades of gray, and I feel like a lot of the Republican Party fails to see that. There's been a lot of battling, a lot of turmoil within this election cycle over those specific things about not being conservative enough.
Voters in Arizona who are considering who they should cast their ballot for, why should they consider Gary Johnson?
Well, one of the huge things that I think is that Gary Johnson has the ability to cross party lines. And that's really what we need right now, because we're kind of in a deadlock. We've got, different agendas in the Congress, different agendas in the Senate, different agendas, with the president. And I think that his particular outlook on things would be able to really cross those party lines and be able to get Democrats and Republicans to see things in a different way.
Gary Johnson, by all accounts, what I've read in some political analysis, he was gaining some steam. And then that interview where he's asked about Aleppo, that was a pretty big political gaffe on his end. How has he recovered, or how does he continue to recover?
Well, a lot of people have seen it as a gaffe, and I really don't see it that way. There's a bunch of things that go into play, and in my opinion, I think it was a fantastic thing that he didn't know what Aleppo was, and it was a fantastic thing that he admitted on camera that he didn't know what was being said, because so many other candidates would have just sat there and pretended until they figured out what he was talking about. And instead, Gary acknowledged that, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. Clear this up for me. And then once he understood what Aleppo was, he was like, yeah, I know what Aleppo is. But that was a game changer, I think, in several aspects. Is, for one, half the people that hadn't heard of Gary Johnson now were like, who's Gary Johnson? We have another choice for president? And then secondly, everyone was like, what's Aleppo? Because I don't think I'd say 2/3 of America didn't know what Aleppo was. I didn't know what Aleppo was. I had to Google it to figure out what it was. And then the third thing that I really want to emphasize on that is these other candidates and stuff, they receive security briefings every day. Full-on security briefings every day. Gary Johnson's flying on Southwest. He's not getting any of this stuff. So he's got to do this all on his own. Had he been receiving Secret Service protection and security briefings and all that jazz, well, maybe Aleppo may have been in the forefront of his mind, but it just wasn't.
Gary Johnson has not been invited to participate in a debate. What does he need to do to get on the stage before November?
So right now, our main focus here in Arizona is getting on the phone and calling people and just reaching out with, just basic questions like, are you going to vote in the presidential debate? Would you consider voting for Gary Johnson? And then, the follow-up question of, do you think Gary Johnson should be allowed in the presidential debates? And then what's the most important issue to you in the current election? Is it the economy? Is it overseas? Is it different things? And that's it. We have 4 simple questions we're asking. We're trying to reach out to 100,000 registered voters from both sides of the aisle to ask those questions and raise awareness about Gary.
And that concludes our program. Next week, we'll hear from the candidates running for congressional districts. For all of us at Arizona Public Media, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Thanks for joining us.